Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that. But it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's prolonlife.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors. I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my brilliant co-host, Brett.
Well, Alice, there's brilliance on the line today, but it's not coming from my microphone. But I appreciate the praise anyway. I'll take everything I can get.
You should take it, and then it ends there, because truly it is a brilliant night. We get to have two incredible guests with us tonight. Those of you who heard our coverage of Leo Schofield also wanted an update when he had his parole hearing. And of course, when we did our coverage, we told you about the amazing podcast dedicated to Leo Schofield's story, Bone Valley. If you somehow have not heard it yet, turn off this podcast, go listen to it. But tonight, we have two people who are very, very close to the case here with us. We have Gilbert King, co-producer and host of Bone Valley. We also have the Honorable Judge Scott Cupp, who is Leo Schofield's attorney, here with us today to, oh my goodness, I mean, two of the most dedicated people I have ever met. And we are just so honored to have you here. Thank you, Scott and Gilbert, for being here.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us. This is really going to be fun.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the thing everybody wants to know is what's the update? What happened with Leo? We can dig into the details in a second, but give us the top of the line.
Yeah, well, the top of the line is on Tuesday morning, just 3 days ago, Leo Schofield was finally released from prison on April 30th. He was released, I believe the correct time was 5:59 a.m., which was pretty early. From there, he basically was escorted out by some marshals or majors until he got to the front prison gate and left on his long ride towards the halfway house where he'll be spending the next year of his life. So yeah, it was an extraordinarily emotional day. I mean, it was a long day, started very early. And I don't know, we can talk about how strange it was. But the one thing I think was really interesting, the first thing we noticed was that Leo's adopted father, Dave, had picked him up in a Tesla along with Chrissy and his half-sister, Pam. And so the four of them got into this Tesla. And just to put it in context, Leo hasn't been in an automobile in 37 years, okay? He's only been on prison buses. And so for me, I get freaked out going into a Tesla here and there, just looking at, the lack of dials and things on the dashboard. It's just a computer. And here's Leo getting into this, basically a computer on wheels. I think it was very disorienting to him, but he enjoyed the ride. It was a very smooth ride. It lasted many hours, but he finally got all the way across the state and made it to his halfway house. And yeah, you can see the picture there. This picture was actually me and Leo saying goodbye at the end of the day. Described it as the longest and hardest hug of my life. Yeah, it was emotional. And, we could hear each other sort of, I want to say, but we were crying a little bit there and hard not to. It was one of many instances of tears that day, actually.
Gilbert, and I want Judge Cupp to weigh in on this as well, because in our lives, we all have accomplishments. We have professional accomplishments, personal accomplishments. and some of them are small and some of them are big. What is it like to know that because of your efforts, and I think this is 100% true, because of the efforts of both of you, this man who spent so many years in prison and might have spent the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit is free?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly, it's just really hard to process. You never get used to it. I've been through it once before with the Groveland Four a few years ago, but those men had all passed away. And so it was really just family members to actually see somebody's life change because of a story. I think all his legal options were gone. He didn't have any chances of any appeal. Nothing was going to happen. It really depended on changing the narrative and having it catch on. And there's no guarantee to that. I told Leo very early on, I said, I believe I've done enough research here where I think I can change the official narrative of this story, but I don't think that's going to make a difference in your life. I can't promise that. And we even talked about that the other day, because I asked him, I said, if I'd have showed up and said to you, look, I'm going to change the narrative on your case and you're going to be out of prison, but it's going to take 5 years, how would you react to that? And he kind of took a deep breath and hadn't thought about that. And he just said something really eloquent. I'll just try to paraphrase. But he said, what really meant a lot to me was the journey and the moments of hope along the way, that you were excited about things that you found. And that was keeping me going, because I had lost hope long time ago in a lot of ways about ever getting out of prison. And so I think when you look at that picture of him hugging, I think those are the kind of things that are running through his head right there. My head was just like, I would take something like this over any literary award or any other thing related to professionalism. This is a human story for me, and this is what means the most.
That's such a good reminder that, we can binge listen to Bone Valley in a matter of days, but this was 5 years of work and 5 years of Leo's life. And of course, for those of you who've listened to Bone Valley, you know that at the very beginning of all of this, how Gilbert gets involved in this case is because of Judge Cupp, who was actually on the bench at the time. Judge Cupp, can you give us just a little bit of background for those who don't know how you came to know Leo in the first place and how you connected with Gilbert, and then the subsequent stepping off of the bench, which is very rare, in order to represent Leo himself?
Yeah, I do come at it from, I guess, a little kind of a different perspective. I met Leo, I guess it's about over 20 years ago. My professional career was, I was mostly a prosecutor, but I did about 10 years of defense work in 2 different stints. And the first time I met Leo was when I had just stopped prosecuting the first time, and it's through a strange set of circumstances, but I ran into Leo's case, and of course immediately was, this guy's, he's not innocent. This is BS. But that quickly changed. So then that's when I started to get to know him and represented him. And then I went back to prosecution, then back to defense a little bit, and then got on the bench. So, but it was always there. I was always, kind of staying in touch with it, and then watched as things kept dragging on, and I could see how the parole process was going. And I just kind of had an epiphany several months before I decided to leave the bench that I just knew. It wasn't like I don't know, it's not a vision, but I just kind of knew if something didn't happen drastically and differently, he was never going to get paroled. And then I started to think, you know what, I've got to step down and represent him in the parole hearings and totally change things around. We had to talk about innocence. And obviously in the intervening time, that's when I ran into Gilbert. Ironically, he was speaking at a judges conference, and he's talking about the devil in the grove, and obviously how well researched that was. And the light clicked. I'm like, this is the guy. He doesn't know it yet, but this is the guy. Sure enough, he did change the narrative. And I think I said at the very beginning with Gilbert, if it wasn't, it needed somebody like him to change the narrative, and it wasn't going to happen inside the courts. I just felt very strongly when I got off the bench that I was going to get him paroled. I didn't know how long it was going to take, but I just felt very deeply committed and sure and confident that we were going to get him paroled. But to actually see it, it's something it's the most remarkable thing I've ever been involved in.
And I got to say, for me personally, listening to you on Bone Valley, I mean, look, the name of the podcast is The Prosecutors. We don't typically think people are innocent when they claim to be innocent. I think a lot of people listening to the show know that. And I just assumed when I started listening to Bone Valley, like you did when you first heard about Leo, this is going to be another podcast talking about a guy who says he's innocent, and they'll probably be really emotional, but there won't be many facts. And then, listening to you talk about it and your history as a prosecutor and how you saw it, I just was like, I have to read this transcript, because everybody kept talking about reading the transcript and just knowing from the transcript. And we always say, like, you need to dig into the case file, right? Like, see what the jury saw, listen to what the jury heard. And then you start reading it, and it just becomes apparent very quickly, all of the holes, just the massive holes and the manipulations and the subtle manipulations that are going on during the trial, and just the impossibilities of various things, how they couldn't have even happened. And it is a truly remarkable story because of what an injustice it is. I mean, there are a few cases there may not be any cases I feel more certain about than I do about this one. I am absolutely certain that Leo is innocent, and it's from the facts and the evidence that make me think that. I mean, he's got a great story, don't get me wrong. And Gilbert, you do a fantastic job. Your podcast is amazing. But this is one of the few cases where you can listen to the podcast, come away, think he's innocent, dig in, and be even more convinced that he's innocent.
Absolutely. And, I think it's really interesting. Both of you mentioned changing the narrative, because obviously, speaking of narratives, that comes up at his parole hearing on April 17th before he is released on April 30th. And we know that there have been many parole hearings before that have not ended with his release. I think that's important because when people hear, without any background, a change in narrative, they think, oh, it's just storytelling. So whoever has the better story wins. We say this all the time. In court, the better story wins. But that's not the case with Leo's story. The reason you're able to change the narrative correctly is because that is the true narrative. It was just buried. When you read the transcript, it seems to be jumping off the page, but for some reason, those holes that are so apparent to anyone who reads that transcript, or hopefully was there at the time, sees it, but they decided not to pull out the very obvious truths. And so instead of changing the narrative, I like to think of what you guys have done is to bring forth the real narrative that has been happening. And obviously there were holes because, the evidence is the evidence at trial. But what you've done, Gilbert, with the help of Judge Cupp, of course, is to find out what those holes were, because when we don't know what those holes are, it's hard to tell the story that makes sense. So I just want to point that out to anyone who may not have background in this, that this is not just about storytelling. This is about bringing out the story that was there all along, but was somehow buried kind of in this landslide that was against Leo.
Yeah, Alice, that's a really great point. I didn't think about that, but I might have to start stealing that from you, because it really is true. I'll confess something. Like, I'm not, like, as prosecutors, you got to sort of take what's given you, what's handed you, and you just have to make the best of them and, decide if it's going to be something you pursue. I have much more freedom in this. And I'll just confess, I do pick easy cases. I don't pick easy stories. But when I do the research and look at the transcripts and start working them, like, these are kind of easy cases. They're really apparent to me. And I'll say, like, in the beginning 5 years, the first year of it, still learning, things come out of left field that you've probably had that experience. Like, wow, I never picked that up in a deposition before. And I can just say, every time something new came to me as I was going through it over the years, it always pointed closer to Jeremy Scott and away from Leo. And that's how I sort of knew, like, there's nothing that's ever going to come up that's going to, be this, Deus Ex Machina dropping out of the sky. Like, oh my God, it's just not there. And you can see where it's going, and you can see the prosecutorial manipulation of some of the evidence and the way they tell the story and get away with it. I'm sure you've seen that in court many times, where one lawyer is just much more aggressive and on top of his game than the other. And you can see where a lot of things get through.
Yeah. And I would say two things. Number one, I think there was a Deus Ex Machina, but it was for Leo. I mean, it is very rare that you find the fingerprints of I don't know if you want to call him a serial killer or a multi-murderer, multi-time violent.
I'm gonna go with serial killer. When you
serial
kill that
killer
many
works
people.
for me. Yeah, in the vehicle like that. I mean, that's incredible. The case. I mean, frankly, by the time we got finished, the way we sort of said it was, if we'd been on the jury and you just heard what you heard and it was presented the way it was presented, I think most people probably would have voted the way most of the jurors voted. They probably would have voted guilty. Looking at the actual evidence, even without Jeremy Scott, by the end of it, if there had been no Jeremy Scott and we'd covered this, we still would have said Leo was innocent, because we went through all the reasons Leo is innocent, even without Jeremy Scott. Jeremy Scott is just, it's like icing on the cake, and it explains so many things that were inexplicable before. Why the car is damaged, why the dump location is where it was, where she went for all that time. Questions that the prosecution could never answer. So, I mean, you're right. There's not going to be a Deus Ex Machina that shows that Leo actually did it, but that's as close as you're going to get to one to show that he's innocent. I can't imagine anything more. And I'll just say this, and Judge, I would be curious what you think about this from a judicial perspective. If finding the fingerprints of a serial killer in the vehicle is not enough newly discovered evidence to get a new trial, I'm not sure what is. Now, maybe you disagree with me on that. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
No, because I was representing him at the time when we were, first presenting that. I think it was 2010, and I could go for a couple hours on that. It should not have happened. This is a great thing about being retired. That was a bad ruling. It was an incorrect ruling. It was, this isn't the correct legal term, but that ruling was a joke. And I think what compounded it for me as a lawyer and then a judge was what the appellate court did with it, what the second district did with it. And that it got worse. It actually got worse. I could go on, but I'm just, to this day, I'm amazed. It should have stopped right then. There's so many times along the way, this thing should have stopped. And it didn't. It just got worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you always said that was really disturbing, and I don't really think I really understood the extent of it, but those fingerprints were discovered in 2004, and Leo didn't get into an evidentiary hearing for 6 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is like
ducking and dodging.
I mean, that's literally the definition of newly discovered evidence. We say this all the time when people are trying to get new trials. They say, there could be DNA that could be tested, but they don't actually come forth with DNA that's matching a known profile of a killer, and this just, it was a shocking ruling, even reading it, post hoc. But that's why, when you said he was out of options legally to prove his innocence. And so obviously he's still convicted of the crime, but all he had left was the possibility of parole, which doesn't erase the conviction, but rather allows him to eventually live kind of in the free world, but still as a convicted felon.
And I do want to ask you something about that, because those of us who've listened to the show, obviously, were listening last year for the last parole hearing. And that one, it felt so desperate in so many ways. You guys meeting with the parole commissioners, laying out the evidence, trying to sway them, and it seeming like they weren't interested in being swayed. Now, obviously, by the end of it, they did not let Leo go, obviously, but they did take this step to move him to a different facility, a facility that is often a place people go in preparation for being released. And I know that gave everyone a lot of optimism. So going into this parole hearing this year, give our listeners a sense of how you felt. I assume you were optimistic, but it was a cautious optimism.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly from my perspective is that, we kind of suspected that once Leo got to the CTP program, he would rise the way he'd always risen in everywhere he's been. And sure enough, that was the case. He immediately stepped into a leadership role, was teaching classes there. He fit right in. And he's not one of those guys that uses his innocence to separate himself from the others. He considers himself one of those brothers. And I think people pick up on that. And that's what really enables him to sort of thrive in the prison system, because he's really about helping people and being, a sincere human being, and not about feeling better than others. And he really does do the work, and he wants to return to that work. So we knew that his, recommendations from there were going to be very strong and powerful. And he'd done everything that had been asked of him, and his year at the reentry program was, stellar. So there really wasn't a lot of wiggle room. If they were just judging it on that, then it looked like he would be a good candidate for parole. But, I maybe Scott, you can speak to this, because I didn't even know the full extent of it, but I've had so many people come up to me, defense lawyers, prosecutors, judges in the state of Florida, saying, you don't know how difficult parole is. It's extraordinarily difficult to get paroled. Maybe you can speak to that, Scott.
Well, in many ways, the last year, well, first of all, once I had a moment to kind of decompress, I felt really good in the days following the May 3rd, last year's parole hearing, because of what it signaled. Not only did they send him to CTP, but they cut it from 2 years to 1 year, which they never do that. They don't do that. They were sending a clear signal. We're going to parole this guy. Just don't screw it up. So in many ways, the last year was so difficult for Leo and I went down and saw him in attorney visits down at Everglades many, many times, probably 10 times. And as we got closer, I tried to keep it real. I kept telling Leo, I don't have any bad news. I don't have any bad news. You're going to get paroled. You're going to get paroled. And it was in many ways, it was making it worse. But I had spoken to the parole commissioners and pretty much knew going into the hearing what was going to happen. But until it actually happens, like one of the last meetings I had with him, he reminded me, and he constantly reads everything. He knows everything. And he said, they remind you in the readings that even though they voted for parole, they until you're actually paroled up until the last minute, they can revoke it. And I said, I know, just try to stay calm. But it really was, it was pretty amazing. But at the end there, knew it was going to happen. And it was, in many ways, it still hasn't sunk in. I'm still kind of trying to process it and getting ready to try to go on to the next step. But it was like I said, a remarkable experience.
Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
And I very much enjoyed hearing from people who spoke on Leo's behalf about the effect he'd had on others and how, he had helped other people in that circumstance turn their lives around and rebuild their lives, and the force for good he was. And I hope he realizes that, as awful, as terrible as this was, and it never should have happened to him, and it's a horrible injustice, the fact that he was able to take that and touch so many lives of people who needed someone. They needed him in their lives in that moment if they were going to ever turn their lives around. And he did that. And I hope that's something that he carries with him as he goes forward, because I'll say this, I often am in the courtroom when people who've been in prison for a very long time are released for one reason or the other. And there's one judge in particular who will often say to them, you're going to feel joy right now, and it's going to feel amazing for the next few weeks. But at some point, this is the reality of what's been taken from you is going to crash down on you. And that PTSD and that the anger and how easy it is after that to fall into depression, even though you're free, and not even realize why you feel that way. And I know he's got a lot of difficulties ahead of him, and we're all celebrating right now, but I know he's got a lot of difficulties ahead of him, and I hope he does take away that positive part, because it was evident from the parole hearing itself how much of an impact he'd had on people.
Yeah, I'd just say one last thing on that. The one thing I discussed with Leo at the parole hearing, I told him, I said, this is for you. You need to tell me, who do you want to have speak? And that was the problem. We only had 10 minutes, and there were so many people. And I'm not talking about, family. Of course, family members and friends want to speak, but inmates and people that have dealt with him. We had prison guards coming up and speaking on his behalf. And I told him, this is for you. You tell me, because like I said, I said, if you, Leo, if you see me, or if you hear that I'm speaking a lot at the hearing, that's a bad sign. That's a bad sign, because the work's been done and you're going to get paroled. So, but it was amazing to me, the people that, they would have lined up out the door to speak on his behalf. And it was none of it was BS. It was all heartfelt.
And so, of course, one thing that was interesting to me when it was time for people to speak in opposition, I know last time one of Michelle's brothers spoke in Leo's favor, but another brother spoke in opposition. I noticed that neither brother spoke this time. Is there anything to that, or was it just?
No, I think, unfortunately for Jesse, who has sort of been someone who's been supporting Chrissy and supporting Leo's parole, he's had a pretty tragic 2024. His partner passed away in a drunk driving accident. She was killed by a drunk driver on New Year's Eve. She died a couple weeks later. And then a month after that, his father passed away, David Somm. And so he was just, the early part of this year was just extraordinarily grieving for him. And, I had spoken to him, and he had volunteered to, do what he could to come up. And, we were just like, Jesse, you're on the record already. Can you just take care of yourself? It's not really necessary, and he was like, okay, man, I really appreciate it, but I'm with you. That's how he talks. And okay, dude, he's just a great guy. And we just sort of cut him a break, because he didn't need to be doing all the traveling and all that stuff. But yeah. And so on this point, it was really just, it wasn't about that. It sort of seemed like maybe it was closer to being a done deal. So a lot of the CTP alumni and people who worked in the prisons who had known Leo, and then, the opposition was just sort of just one assistant state attorney, really.
Now let's talk about that, because
was that a great segue or what?
That was a great
That was a
segue.
great segue.
It's like you're in this business.
Yeah, almost. Right.
I will say this, and we've said this before. We're in the prosecution business. I've worked for a state government before, and I don't mind when if the state still believes in its conviction for whatever reason, supports that conviction and defends that conviction. And it did not surprise me that someone from Florida showed up to talk about the case. What did surprise me was what they chose to use their time to say, because it wasn't about Leo. It was about Gilbert King. and I will say this, when I heard him saying it, and you mentioned this before we went live, so we'll just bring it out. I was thinking, well, this is good. This is good for Leo.
Yep.
Because the guy has nothing to say about Leo. He's just talking about Gilbert. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get sort of your reaction to that. But I also want to talk about some of the stuff he said, because frankly, I didn't think it was fair, and I didn't think it was true. And I think we should address that. But what were your thoughts when you heard him begin to talk about the multi-episode podcast that had been launched in Leo's defense?
Well, I would start out by saying it was a little bit bizarre, actually. For 36 years, the state has just been beating up Leo's reputation in these hearings, referring to him as, a vicious, cold-blooded, highly manipulative murderer who cannot be out on the streets, has to be, society must be protected. And then podcast comes out, and it's like he's going to go up there and defend his old boss's reputation for something not having to do with the case at all, but something that was said in a parole hearing. I just thought that was kind of weird. But I agree with you. The more he was talking, I was like, wow, this is going on a long time. He's actually pretty complimentary of the podcast. It's very compelling, some very dramatic. He was saying all these things, but then he sort of turned on it. And, I was just sort of surprised that he was taking issue with something that was, said in the podcast from a parole hearing. And so we can go into that. But to me, it was just very strange to hear that. But I was very grateful that, he was putting all his attention on me in the podcast, because I knew I could absorb that. I just didn't want to see Leo Leo takes that stuff very personally. He really does get triggered when they call him a murderer. You would think that wouldn't be the case, but if you think somebody's innocent, that you could see where that would be triggering.
And I do think it's important to talk about the specifics that the state brings up. But before we get there, I think you're exactly right. Usually the state has an interest in showing up and defending a conviction. That's not what happened here. And so after I listened to it, I actually had to listen to his statement a couple times because I was trying to figure out what it was. It was very impassioned. Everyone else who spoke during the parole hearing, whether for or against Leo, there was kind of a cadence to it, right? I mean, it's a respectful room. You're speaking to a parole board. It's not meant to be a showboat situation. It is meant to just convey your experience. But his did feel a little bit more like it was meant for the presses. And afterwards, I thought, oh, okay, this doesn't have to do with really Bone Valley or Leo. Rather, and I'm giving this an interpretation in the shiniest light possible because I'm trying to understand why this really showmanship at the parole hearing that, as you said, seemed like a done deal. He was mad about the media effect. Some call it the serial effect, where podcasters or other kind of not really journalists, but people who put themselves out as journalists, put out different pieces of advocacy pieces that are not responsible, that don't really dig into the facts and simply have one aim: to tell a narrative, whether it's rooted in truth or not, for whatever reason. But it didn't have to do with Bone Valley. That does happen in media. That happens with irresponsible journalism. And it was almost like, judges or parole board, be aware that generally there is this movement in media where people want to jump on board to a cause. Don't always listen to them. But this was not the right case for it. So if that was in fact his message, I thought it was lost because as Judge Cupp knows, we say bad facts create bad law. If he's trying to make a good point, I think this was the absolutely wrong vehicle for it. So this was me trying to understand his impassioned display that seemed completely mismatched for the situation.
Right. And, I think his main point that he was trying to make was that when we described the testimony from Jerry Hill from the 2020 hearing, we presented in a way that shows that, one of the things, I don't know if I've heard Judge Cupp say this before, but parole hearings are kind of the Wild West of the law. You can get in there and pretty much say anything you want. You can bring up polygraph tests. You can talk about someone's lack of remorse. There's no objections. There's no bench conferences. There's no moment where these, defense can rise and say, excuse me, he just misstated that. Can we meet it? You can't do that. It's just,
there's no rules of evidence.
Right. And so all of these things that, I've seen judges, like even the trial judge, correct it from the original trial. This stuff makes its way back into the parole hearing and nobody objects to it. It's almost like this is the facts of the case. And, I think I want to encourage, I'll talk about what Jacob Orr, who's the assistant state attorney who spoke at the parole hearing, but he's referring to the 2020 testimony of Jerry Hill. And I've sent you guys the full clips of that so you can, I think listeners can go in there and listen for themselves and try to, listen for themselves and see if the points that we were trying to make in the podcast line up with what you heard. I think you can tell when you listen to Jerry Hill's testimony that he gets confused by his own notes. And he himself doesn't really have a firm grasp of the facts of the case. So he makes a lot of mistakes and misstatements along the way. And I just want to say, we do not accuse Jerry Hill of lying or intentionally conflating Leo and Leo Sr. in this part of the testimony. In fact, in the podcast, I've specifically used this language to address that. I say, Jerry Hill gets it wrong in a major way. And we play some lines where it sounds like he is conflating Leo and Leo's father about who found the body. And our exact quote is, he makes it sound like it was Leo himself who had the premonition. And when Jacob Orr was describing this, he pointed to one instance where he took the lines and he said, we omitted these lines. And we were just trying to really give a big picture takeaway of all of this, because this happened constantly throughout Jerry Hill's testimony. It's like 9 minutes of testimony. And we're not trying to impeach his integrity. We're really just showing examples of how he was confusing people in that hearing room. I'll just tell you, I myself and Kelsey spoke to at least 6 people who attended that hearing, and every one of them came away with that exact same thought. He got Leo and Leo Sr. mixed up. He did it throughout his testimony. And these were people who knew the facts of the case. Jerry Hill really did make it sound like that Leo was the one who found the body. And I just want to give you an example of this. I have a clip here. And we did not, this is interestingly, we get accused sometimes of leaving things out of the podcast. We actually did include this clip in the podcast. And it's also something that you'll notice the very last sentence is very telling. And Jacob Orr also left that out of his testimony before the parole commissioners a couple weeks ago. So let me sort of set the scene. After dumping the pictures from Michelle's autopsy on the commissioners, Jerry Hill starts out with the basic summary of the case against Leo Schofield. But very early into the first part of his testimony, he says this, and this is clip 3.
Okay. So for those of you listening, we're going to play it. Hopefully you can hear it. And then we're going to, when you're listening later with our beautiful editor, it'll be even better.
Mrs. Schofield's body was discovered in a canal located in a heavily wooded area on the morning of February 27th, 87 by Leo Schofield, Sr. Mr. Schofield claimed at various times that God's voice or a premonition led him to her body, or that an inner force had driven him to that location. And the reason I'm going over this is he's never admitted his guilt.
That was an example where he does sort of identify Leo and Leo Sr. correctly. But that last line is the one that Jacob Orr left off when he was reading the testimony of the commissioners. And what does he say? And the reason I'm going over this is that he's never admitted his guilt. Who is Jerry Hill talking about here, Leo or Leo Sr.? This is how that whole presentation starts. And it was not edited. That was his exact words. And this is the kind of pivoting back and forth between Leo and his father that confused everybody that attended that hearing. It's still confusing to me. To me, like leaving that line off there, that very last line, just sort of shows how the 10th Circuit continues to misrepresent this case at every phase.
And let me just say this. I mean, for those of you, number one, Jerry Hill, he was Aguero's boss, right?
Right.
So John Aguero is the one who prosecuted Leo. Most of you know assistant district attorneys work for a state's attorney, I guess, in Florida, and that's Jerry Hill. And so Jerry Hill would show up at these parole hearings well after John Aguero had passed away and do this. And I think was Jerry Hill even still the DA at that point, or was he just so invested?
Yeah, he retired in like 2016, I believe, 2017. And then what his main job now is he just goes to the parole hearings and represents the state. And his quote is basically, parole is not done until the sentence is committed, something along those lines. And basically saying like, even if it's 25 to life, we're going for life. He's not getting out. And that's what he does. He shows up and basically resists just about every parole.
And the thing about the parole, the folks who are doing the parole, I mean, number one, they're not deciding guilt or innocence. That's not what it's about. Number two, if you listen to that parole hearing, it was really long. It was a really long parole hearing. They have a lot of cases that they're managing.
Yeah.
They do not have the understanding of this case that Gilbert has, or that Judge Cupp has, or that we have, or probably that anybody who listened to either podcast has. They have a general understanding, but, they are counting on the information that they receive from the state and other people to be correct. And I'll just say this. When you are arguing for the state, for the government, or really for anyone, you have an obligation not to misrepresent the facts, even if those facts are not in your favor. Now, you can explain why the facts should be viewed in your favor. That's fine. But, when I write a brief and I write the facts section, it's really important that I get the facts right. And it was incumbent upon him to get the facts right. Because in misleading the parole committee, even if he didn't intend to, and I think you're right, I don't think he intended to, that is a dereliction of his duty, in my view. And it wasn't the only thing he said, and it wasn't the worst thing he said. There was worse.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I'm going to go to another clip just to give you a taste of what And Jerry Hill did his presentation in 3 different parts. And the first part he did that, and he just kind of conflated it. And in the very beginning, I think people in the hearing room were like, "What is he talking about? Who is it? Leo and Leo Sr." He does it again, going back and forth between Leo and the father. In the third part of his testimony, he addresses Jeremy Scott. And we did not include this in Bone Valley either. And, frankly, I think Jerry Hill should probably send me Christmas cards for leaving this out. But at this point in his testimony, Hill refers to Jeremy Scott only as Jeremy Scott or Mr. Scott. And at this point, he has referred to Leo Schofield Jr. as the defendant 18 times. Let me just say that again. Jerry Hill refers to Leo as the defendant 18 times before he says this. And this is clip 6.
In September, the defendant sends a letter to counsel admitting to the murder of Mrs. Schofield.
Right. So now he's basically saying that Leo has confessed to killing Michelle. And the point you just made about the parole commissioners having all these cases before them, they don't know all the facts of the case. I think in this particular case, it's a little bit different. They know a little bit more. But for the most part, they're relying on the reputation of an elected state attorney who's been in office for 32 years before taking on these parole commissioners. And so there was a local journalist after that in Lakeland named Billy Townsend was listening to this and read this. He asked the state for a response. And I think Jacob Orr was the one who responded to him. And he said, it's obvious that Jerry Hill was referring to a defendant, Jeremy Scott, that wrote a letter admitting to a murder and was later found to be not credible. And I'll be honest with you, I thought the same thing when I heard it. I said, he just mixed up Jeremy Scott with Leo. Not good in a parole hearing. You definitely don't want to be confused with a man who's killed multiple people. But Jerry Hill had just gotten that confused. And, we didn't put it in the podcast because we didn't feel like we needed to keep beating him up over this bizarre testimony. So we left it out. But Jacob Orr's point was that nobody was confused by Jerry Hill insinuating that Leo had confessed to killing his wife, Michelle. But something happened 1 year. It's almost exactly 1 year ago, the day before Leo's parole hearing of May 3rd in 2023. Scott Cupp had stepped down from the bench to become Leo's lawyer. And he asked me to accompany him in meetings with the parole commissioners, in advance of the hearing. He wanted me there to address any questions about the facts if they came up. So on the afternoon of May 2nd, 2023, we met with one commissioner in a conference room at the Florida Commission of Offender Review. And right off the bat, this commissioner told us that they were still struggling with Leo's parole because Leo confessed. I remember, Judge, you were there. You and I kind of looked at each other like, what is he talking about?
I almost fell out of my chair.
I mean, here's the thing. While the parole board has a lot of cases, we recognize that, DAs, prosecutors also have a lot of cases. It doesn't matter. That's why, all of us, before we put anyone on the stand or before we go into court, we review the facts. Human mistakes still happen. And if there is any question that there is confusion, the DA's office really had an obligation to the public to correct it. And look, as long as you say mea culpa, or you don't even have to say mea culpa, you can simply say, in case there was any confusion, let me be clear. Even the way the DA handled it after the fact, they can go back and listen or read the transcript and know that there could be confusion. It is their duty to the public, not necessarily even just to Leo. It's much broader than that. The DA is there for justice for the entire public. They had a duty to correct any sort of potential confusion. And I would say probably a letter to the parole board, but I don't know Florida system.
Yeah. And, it basically allowed Jerry Hill to declare Leo Schofield a confessed murderer and, by accident. And he refused to make a correction on that. I mean, I think the reporter actually confronted him about it and said, are you going to correct that? And his response was, "F you." He said, "What's the name of the father, Billy? It's Leo." As if, that would really clear things up a lot. It almost implies that he intended to do it because he's saying they both had the same name, so I didn't make a mistake. But, obviously everyone was confused. And I also think Jacob Orr's point that, nobody was confused by what Jerry Hill has said in there. Well, one person was confused, a parole commissioner. And, you have to wonder if Jerry Hill's misspoken words that day added 3 more years to Leo's incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I think everybody who's listening to this, if you heard that parole thing, we always say, look, go to the sources. That's what we always say. We're going to put the full statement of Jerry Hill on the website, prosecutorspodcast.com. We'll share it on Twitter and on Facebook and everywhere else. Listen to it. You know the facts. All of you out there who are listening, you know the facts of this case. Listen to what he says and think about how if you didn't know him as well, or even as well as you know them, if it's confusing what he says, Listen to the context. Listen to all the context. And I think what you're going to find is it was incredibly confusing, and it's just unfortunate that it appears that the people who are representing the state of Florida and the district were more concerned about the reputation of this prosecutor than they were about the truth in this case. And frankly, it doesn't feel like this is the first time that that's happened in this case. It feels like from the moment Leo was convicted, protecting the people who were involved in his conviction, including John Aguero, was paramount. And that's what they've been doing for the last 30 something years. And like I said, I don't mind defending a conviction, but I have a problem when your ego is more important than justice.
And the reason we're talking about it now is not just to beat up on Hill, like you said, from 2020. Rather, the state chose to bring this up at the parole hearing just a couple of weeks ago. That's why we're talking about it. Because it would be one thing if a mistake was made in the past, you dealt with it poorly, you don't then highlight it and call the journalist who called out the inaccuracy as someone who is trying to spin a narrative that is not rooted in fact. That's what I found very confusing about the state's decision to no longer are they trying to really talk about Leo, but now they are truly thinking, it seems like, their ego rather than pursuit of truth. And that was very disheartening, which is why I'm trying to grasp at something different. Maybe they're trying to make some statement about the power of media and how they don't like it. But I think it was absolutely inappropriate when they knew the mea culpa from 2020 to bring it up now, seemingly in their favor, and to mislead the board again.
Right. And then, they also used that one instance where they saying, we edit out lines to distract from what he was saying. But again, you listen to the whole thing, you be the judge of that. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious for anybody who listens to the entire testimony. I think that's one of those things where they do bring these things up over and over, and especially they're given a little more freedom in a parole hearing. So you can see they get a little looser with the facts. And I just want to point out one of these things, because these things absolutely drive me crazy. And I see them not only in parole hearings, I see them in appellate opinions leaked out from, like, the prosecutor will reword something in a motion, and then it gets picked up by the judge and it becomes part of the opinion and becomes fact, and it becomes referred to over and over. And I just want to point out one more of these things that just comes up. And this is something we didn't put in the podcast. There's a lot we didn't put in the podcast that would have helped Leo. But part of the problem is when you don't have tape for it, and you guys know this, when you don't have tape for it, it's just less interesting. And you have to hear my voice, and I get sick of hearing my voice half the time anyway, so it's like, I don't want to be reading testimony, but I'm going to do it for you guys because I think this one's kind of important. And this is something that it's not just Jerry Hill in the 2020 opinion, but it comes up over and over in all the appellate opinions and motions. And it also comes up in past parole hearings. So in the 2020 hearing, Jerry Hill says this, and he's talking about the case. During the investigation, Mr. Schofield Sr. interfered with law enforcement when they attempted to survey the master bedroom in the trailer, a possible crime scene. It was in disarray, dresser drawer broken, missing sheets from the bed. Mr. Schofield became angry and barred law enforcement from entering the trailer the day the victim was discovered. The defendant was with him at the time, side by side. Immediately following Mrs. Schofield's funeral, the defendant was out to clubs and dating other women. He did not assist in planning the funeral. Again, this is an instance of Jerry Hill either, making an honest mistake, or just he's using incorrect information prepared by an assistant state attorney. Having been retired and out of this case for so long, I just think he was going to his notes and then maybe coming off his notes and doing so in a way that didn't really work out too well for him. But let me read from the police report on February 27th. This is the day that law enforcement showed up at Leo's trailer the day Michelle's body was discovered. According to detectives, Leo was not there, as Hill misstates. It was Jim Anderson, Buddy's father, who was with Leo Sr. And this is verbatim from Detective Weeks' report. Quote, Ryder and Putnell followed them to the victim's trailer, arriving at approximately 22:20 hours. Mr. Schofield advised that his son was too upset to come, so he decided to meet with us. Ryder observed the living room and kitchen area covered with newspapers and what appeared to be dog feces on the floor. The front bedroom was empty except for some boxes, and there was dog feces on the carpet in the master bedroom. Ryder observed numerous photographs spread out on the victim's waterbed and open dresser drawers, which appeared to have been gone through and one drawer broken. Laying on the top of the drawer was a letter to Dean, and part was found with Holiday Inn Memorial Boulevard on it. It was at this time that Leo Sr. became upset with us looking at his son's papers, so Ryder and Putnell terminated our looking. Putnell informed Leo Sr. that this was why we wanted Leo Jr. present so we could see what we were doing. Leo Sr. advised that we could continue. However, we advised we would return at a later date. Leo Sr. agreed to have Leo Jr. meet us back at the trailer the following day. Okay, so that police report has suddenly morphed into Leo and Leo Jr., Leo Sr. and Leo Jr. barring them from entry. When in fact, according to the police report, they're actually in the bedroom. They're looking around. They're examining the place. At one point, Leo Sr. does get upset because they're going through some papers. He says he wants his son there. They volunteer to leave. And Leo Sr. says, you can keep looking. And they say, no, we'll come back tomorrow so we can speak to his son. This is another one of those instances, and there's lots of them in this kind of testimony where the state really just twists everything that this police report implied and just puts it the worst possible spin on it. You know, it's just the countless examples of these kind of things happening in this case. And, you know, again, it's not that interesting for me to read that. And you can see why we left that out of the report, especially since the detectives wouldn't talk to us. But it's a very important thing because I'm a firm believer that the defense has a little bit more leeway to play with the truth in a trial. But the prosecutor, the state, I think, has the obligation to not just seek convictions and wins, but seek justice. And by doing this, I just think it's a very disingenuous way to prosecute a case.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Judge Cupp, you can speak to this having been a prosecutor as well as being on the bench, but we are always told that we are supposed to wear the white hat. We have to make sure, and Brett and I have done this multiple times when we are in an adversarial hearing where there is a bad fact for us, but the defense hasn't raised it. I always raise it. I do not want it to be somehow, worked against the defendant. I want all the facts in front of the judge, even if they are bad for me. I'm going to make my argument as to why I have the better argument. But it is our duty to make sure justice is reached. And it doesn't mean a single-minded kind of advocacy for a conviction. That's not our role as prosecutors.
And once again, there's a difference between having a fact and making an argument about how that fact is beneficial to you. It would be one thing to say the reason that Leo Sr. was angry is because he was, at that point, he was afraid they might find something that Leo had hidden. But saying they blocked you from searching is a fact that not only appear in appellate opinions, we saw that again and again as we're covering the case. People who think Leo's guilty. Well, why wouldn't you let them search the trailer then? It's like, that's not true. Where are you getting that? But, the more you repeat it, the more it becomes truth.
Yeah, and I'm fighting to stay quiet. That's the thing that outraged me from the very beginning, because this type of thing that y'all are discussing and that Gilbert has laid out, this has happened in Leo's case from virtually the very beginning. From the moment Aguero touched down in that county and started to put this case together. And it's happened over and over and over. And I'm not as forgiving as Gilbert is. This is how these folks operate. And I'll tell you, I prosecuted in 4 different circuits. Well, one twice, but basically all over the state of Florida. I've never seen an office operate the way that this office has operated. And it just, in the words of Senator Jonathan Martin, everything he saw in this case makes him sick to his stomach. It's just not right. And it never stopped. I mean, look what we're talking about at the last parole hearing. You guys have laid it out. They're not talking about anything having to do with the case. They're fighting these battles like it's so maddening. This is true because I say it's true. End of subject. That's the way they operate. And Leo has literally suffered for 36 years because of it.
And the one of the pieces of evidence that is another one that gets presented again and again that is literally what you just said. It's true because I say it's true. Is that the night Michelle went missing, Leo was witnessed putting something heavy in the back of his car.
Yep.
Even though that is literally not the testimony of the witness who the prosecution claims to have seen that. She literally testifies, and even the defense attorney, who wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed for most of the trial, manages in cross-examination to get out that it wasn't that night that she saw this thing that would be incredibly significant if someone had just been murdered in the trailer, that it didn't even happen that night, that it happened several nights before. She even said that. She even testified to that. And yet the prosecutor, and Gilbert, you can talk about this in closing argument, is recreating that when he's telling the story as, Alice Scott sees what she sees, and then her sister-in-law comes home, and what does she see? She sees Leo carrying something heavy and put it in the car, and Alice Scott saw the same thing. These two women can testify to this, and it's amazing. It really is amazing. And it goes to one of the things that's so troubling in this case, and we talk about this all the time. A case that rests entirely on witness testimony is a case that you should be really concerned about. People want to talk about circumstantial evidence. Give me circumstantial evidence any day versus a lineup of people telling a story that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard that a million times too, about prosecutors would much rather have a circumstantial case. In a lot of cases, defense attorneys hate these kind of cases, actually. But, one of the things you mentioned right there, and this is really the crux of the case is, and this is the part in the transcript where I sort of slowed down and paid real attention to it the first time I read it. And I still go back to it. And I went back to it recently. Alice Scott says what she says, about, seeing Leo carry something heavy out. I think one of the most important pieces of testimony in this, and you guys talked about it a lot on the podcast, was Linda Sells, the sister-in-law, who is brought up on the stage to sort of back up Alice's testimony. And, looking back at that again, I really think something happened in John Aguero's office about this particular testimony, because he calls her to the stand and he allows her to say, on one particular evening, I saw Leo carrying something heavy, and he doesn't pin her down on that. And I talked to Linda Sells, and she said, I stand by all my testimony and everything I've ever said since. She was very adamant about that. She didn't want to speak on record or on be recorded, but she was very adamant that she stuck by everything she said. And I firmly believe that she probably told John Aguero that it wasn't that night. And I think maybe John has said, just tell the story and I won't make it that night. And she starts out saying one particular evening, and he never questions her. And he does that with a couple of these witnesses that are really damaging to Leo. He never gets them to say the courtroom identification. Do you see that man that you saw in the middle of the night standing on the side of State Road 33 right here in court? He never does that with those witnesses. And those are the witnesses that came and changed their testimony 15 months later in his office. So they heard their original statement said nothing about this. And now 15 months later, Aguero's got them saying these things. And that's where the case comes together. And that always set off alarms for me.
Let me just say one other thing on this. Cannot be overstated enough. Without that single fact of that witness, Alice Scott, saying that she saw Leo carrying something heavy, which then gets conflated that it's a body, that it's Michelle. Without that fact, there's no conviction. There's no case. The state's case should have been JOA'd at the end of the state's case. Without that fact, they have no case. That's what's so maddening, and as Gilbert touched on, and the other testimony by the LaFoons and Thurman Toole, all this stuff about, what who was seen and what was seen. There was never any in-court identification of Leo. And these are the LaFoons. They knew Leo. They lived by him. If they saw him out there, they would have identified him. They would have said that we saw Leo out there, or we saw somebody who looked like Leo. They didn't even say that. So that's what's so maddening.
Especially since they had talked to the police a couple days after the body was found and said that Leo was down at the bar saying he did it. You think when you're telling that story, you'd be like, and wouldn't you know it? I saw him out dumping the body too, but he just conveniently leaves that out for the next 18 months or whatever. I don't know. It's something. And we've talked about this, Gilbert, and just for those of you out there, sometimes people ask, what is the obligation of the prosecutor? We got 3 of them on here. So if I misstate anything, you can let me know. As I've said, there is nothing wrong with arguing a fact. And there's nothing wrong with believing that what the witness is saying is the truth, getting them to say the truth, and then stopping because they're a bad witness. And if you ask one more question, they're liable to fall all over themselves and mess it up, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But when you know for a fact that what the witness is saying is misleading and isn't actually even relevant to the case, you know that, and you let them put that information out there and you don't correct it. That, in my mind, is unethical. That is not what you're supposed to do as a prosecutor.
I mean, if this were my witness and this is what you're supposed to do, let's say you're talking to the witness and she tells you this story. Yeah, I saw Leo carry something heavy. You have to ask that follow-up question, right? Was it that night? And if you press and press, this is how you get to whether you even put her on the stand to talk about this. Is it possible? This is for the best case scenario for the prosecutor. You don't remember the night. Narrow it down. Was it springtime? Was it nighttime? Was it whatever? Is there a possibility it could have been in the vicinity of this time period? Yes. Okay. Maybe I'll put you up there. And then I don't argue that it was that night. I say, of course she doesn't remember. It's been months. I can't remember what I had for lunch. But you know what she saw? She saw Leo carry something incredibly heavy. She never saw this before, and she never will again because there's one Michelle. That's what he can argue. But to intentionally mislead like that is irresponsible. And here's the thing. If she's saying that she cannot commit, I don't know. It really cannot be that. I, as the prosecutor, am supposed to make that decision. I am the sieve, right? Not putting you on for that particular fact because it's misleading. I can't pin you down. I can't use it. I'm not going to put you up there for that.
And if you do put her up there,
right,
you're supposed to disclose to the defense that in your interview whether
she doesn't know.
Yeah, she doesn't actually know. I mean,
not that Jack Edmond would have saw that.
There are just so many duties. This is why we've always said there really should never be any Perry Mason moments in trial ever, right? Because when you discover a bad fact for you, you have to turn it over in fact. And that's why maybe you make the tactical decision not to really interview her, but then you don't put her on the stand either. And so I think this is important to talk about because there are ways to argue bad facts. There are ways to make your argument even without facts. But to leave something out there, whether it's at the parole hearing, by the way, or in trial, that is just blatantly misleading is unethical.
Yeah. And I just always felt like, they mention a lot, like, this prevents an honest review. What we only asked from the parole commission is an honest review of this case. And, it really just, goes back to me, like, if you really want an honest review, switch it over to a conviction integrity review unit. I'll give you all my files. We can all sit down and we'll let the chips fall where they may. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but there's a way to do it. And I don't really think the 10th is interested in that.
Well, it should happen, and this shouldn't be the end. And the only thing I'm concerned about is because the pressure of Leo being in prison is off, that the fact that he's lost all these years as an innocent man in prison, it won't be forgotten. I mean, you're not going to forget it. We're not going to forget it, but it may not get the attention it deserves at the highest levels in the state of Florida because this is an injustice. And as much as, if I think somebody's guilty, I'm going to fight to keep them in prison as long as they should be in prison. But these things do happen. And I think it's important for everyone out there. I mean, our listener base is much like us. They don't think many people are innocent. But I think that it's important for everybody out there listening to this, if you're committed to justice and for the right person being in prison, to think about this case seriously and what it means to have an example here of someone who was innocent, who was incarcerated for a murder they did not commit. And what a terrible thing that is. What a terrible thing it was for Michelle and her family. What a terrible thing it was for Leo. What a terrible thing it was for the justice system as a whole. And the fact that you had Jeremy Scott out in the world, who knows all the damage he did. I mean, we know he killed at least one more person, right?
Yeah.
After this. And I'm not saying the police should have been able to get him at the time, though I still don't understand why you don't run those fingerprints against the known offenders in the area. But putting that aside, there was a lot of damage done because of the way this prosecution was handled. And this isn't a simple mistake. Simple mistakes happen. And people get prosecuted by good, honest prosecutors who prosecute somebody and they turn out to be innocent. That does happen. I do not believe that's what happened in this case.
I was just thinking about a lot what you guys say and the way you talk about prosecutions and the system. And it occurred to me, like, the entire point of Bone Valley isn't that we have a corrupt or flawed legal system. What I found in like all the prior work that I've done in Central Florida over the last 20 years are heroic examples of the system, being fair and being a vehicle of justice. But it's dependent on the operators of the system as to whether, it functions justly or corruptly. I think the listeners of Bone Valley have met, both heroic and corrupt operators within this system, the criminal justice system. And the outcomes are, a function of the operators, not the system. It reminds me of what Senator Jonathan Martin said at Leo's parole hearing last year when he said, this is his quote, "I stand by the criminal justice system here in the state of Florida. We're one of the best on the planet, but there's a whole lot of doubt right now about how good we are." One of the questions I'm asked the most is, what can I do? Everyone asks me that. What can I do to help or anything? And the answer, I think, is to really re-examine the incentives that are built into our system and to understand who has the advantages in the criminal justice system and examine the motives of the people who operate the levers of the system. And that's really what we were trying to do in Bone Valley, to take a deeper look at the operators, not the whole criminal justice system.
So kind of with that, I don't know if you want to take a little bit of time to say what's next for Leo now that he's at the halfway house for the next year, and also maybe what's next for Bone Valley.
Mm-hmm. Scott, why don't you do Leo?
Well, Leo obviously is at the halfway house. He's the terms of his parole. Well, he's on parole until they say no more. He's in the halfway house for a year. The first 6 months are on community control, which is very, it's very stringent, very difficult. You have to literally account for every minute of your day. And if it's not on your schedule and you're someplace that's not on your schedule, it's like you literally can't stop on the way home to pick up some groceries if it's not on your schedule. But that's what he's doing now. And he'll be employed. We don't know where yet, but we're working on that. And then the rest of what I'm doing, I'm not going to talk about. But I'm going to be talking to some folks, and I've got some ideas. And when it happens, we'll come back on.
There you go. Awesome. Yeah. And as for Bone Valley, well, we're working on this episode around Leo's release. I kind of feel like this is sort of the end of the story, so to speak. He's going to be out of prison. I mean, it won't be the technically end because we'll check in with him and stuff, but we really want to do kind of a special episode and take our time with it. Because usually what we're doing is like these things happen, we try to rush it out really quick, and they're still really interesting episodes, but we don't really put the kind of like time that we need to think about things and write it the way we want to do it. So we're kind of doing it this way this time. And so we're really just pulling tape together. We have a lot of tape from the whole couple days leading up to it and afterwards. And we did spend a lot of time with Leo. And, I think part of it is this interview that we do with him that's outside of prison for the first time in 37 years, really. And just to hear he's just so eloquent, and just to hear his perceptions of things and what it was like his first day of freedom. It's really fascinating. And we have a lot of really good pictures from the day too, and some pretty big surprises. It's going to be very emotional, I think, really much more emotional than I even expected, given how it turned out. And so that's the sort of the way this series is going to come to an end. I will say that my obsessive nature and just learning things along the way in this case has sort of led me down a road that's within this case, but a very different area. And so that's what we're really exploring for season 2. I can't really get too specific into it right now because my people at Lava for Good have sort of said, kind of be quiet about that for now. But I can just tell you that you'll recognize some of it's very similar to what I did after I wrote Devil in the Grove. A deputy came up to me and said, "Hey, you got your story right, because I used to be one of Willis McCall's deputies, but how come you never wrote about this kid?" I said, "We framed this kid. I can tell you exactly how he did it." And I'm like, "What?" And so that became my next book and the next 5 years of my life. And I stayed in Lake County, Florida for that. And that's kind of what happened in this case. Something else happened in Polk County that really took me by surprise. And when we all looked at it, we said, there it is. That's season 2. So that's what we're going to be doing in the coming, however many months it takes.
Has Leo got the band back together or what?
Yeah, that's going to be kind of tricky. We all chipped in and got him a new guitar, and he played that for us. It's gorgeous and he loves the sound of it. So he's got his first guitar that's not state-owned in decades. I'm hoping that he doesn't throw it into a bonfire like he did with the last one.
Well, I'm excited to know what your next project is because I love everything that you cover. It's always with such integrity and such an eye to detail. But also, though Leo's story may be coming an end, in Bone Valley, I do hope that you convey to him that we know this is the beginning of an incredible chapter and that he's given us and so many people who now know his story hope of how to live your life when everything seems to be stacked against you, when there is injustice, when life is not fair. Many of us, I think it's easy to look at things when they're clearly, you're in the wrong. People can understand why things happen to you. But for Leo, the more we look at this case, the more it seems that he has just been served an incredible injustice. Yet he never wallows in it and he never gives into it, but rather he has turned something horrible into something beautiful. And I fully expect that to continue in the halfway house and beyond. And so I hope you convey that to him, that there are kind of legions of us out here rooting for him and excited to see this next chapter of all he's going to do for good.
Well, that's so beautiful, Alice. And we will definitely be conveying that. And, you never know. You might see him on one of these screens popping up before you know it. So
he would always be welcome.
Absolutely. And, just one more time. Good job, guys.
Good job.
Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And tell Kelsey we said awesome work as well.
Yes, awesome
Definitely
job.
will. Thank you very much.
Job. Well, we have kept you guys, we always, when we first started this particular podcast, we were like 30 minutes. It'll be quick updates. People will get tired of us after 30 minutes. And here we've kept you well past an hour, especially at this late hour on a Friday night. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for what you do for Leo, but really for the justice system writ large. So much good has come from this and so much good will continue to come from this. And thank you for sharing your stories with us. You guys, we are so lucky to have Judge Scott Cupp and Gilbert King of Bone Valley with us. Please go listen to Bone Valley if you haven't already. And I'm just going to go ahead and sign off for now because they've said it so beautifully. Please let us know what you think. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com and on all the social medias at prosecutorspod. Brett, is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off for today?
I got nothing.
There's still a lot to say, and maybe we'll hear more from Gilbert in season 2. Who knows?
We will.
But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Thank
Yay.
you guys.
Thank
You guys
so
are so
much.
good. Thank you so much. You guys made that so much easier to just have a conversation and just talk about it. Glad that you joined us, Judge Cupp.
Yeah. I didn't know that I was going to be joined.
Well,
I mean,
we appreciate
it. Really is. You're so humble about it. But I remember the very first episode of Bone Valley when it's all about the note that you passed, Judge Cupp, Gilbert, and I paused it and I called Brett. I was like, "A judge passed him a note."
She did. She literally did that.